That was the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Secretary of the Treasury Steven Mnuchin speaking in Washington, D.C. And what they've just announced is a ratcheting up of sanctions on the Iranian government. A series of new sanctions really have been announced. I'll just tell you some of what those are. The U.S. Secretary of Treasury did announce 17 new sanctions. They target Iran steel and iron industries. He says this is to further hamper the Iranian economy. And the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that the newest sanctions on Iran will also be targeting 8 senior officials that have allegedly plotted attacks within the region and abroad. That's according to the Secretary of State. And just a reminder that U.S. officials say these sanctions follow the missile strikes that took place on U.S. bases in Iraq. And that was as a result of the killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, joining us from Washington. You were listening in. This is really a ratcheting up, as I'm saying, Kimberly, of the sanctions on Iran.
Ratcheting it up, and there was some speculation here in Washington, just among the reporters here, waiting for this announcement to come down. And the question becomes, is this also a face-saving measure by the U.S. president, who promised that if Iran struck back against the United States for its assassination of General Soleimani, that he would not hesitate to act? But then, of course, when those strikes came, we did see hesitation on the part of the president, at least militarily. Now, we have heard since then, when he spoke to the American public in the hours after those strikes, that he said, in fact, that there would be sanctions, but he gave no specifics. So this is something that we have been waiting for, Doreen. And to put this all into context, I think it's important to know for our viewers where things stand with respect to sanctions, because this maximum pressure economic campaign by the United States has been in place for some time. It started with the withdrawal of the United States from the agreement, the JCPOA, to limit Iran's nuclear program. That's when those snapback sanctions that had been lifted as a result of Iran signing that agreement were put back in place. Then we had more sanctions put in place by the United States last June, hard-hitting sanctions targeting Iran's supreme leader as well as the foreign minister. And then last September, targeting the central bank and the sovereign wealth fund. So it really does now appear, and we heard there from the Treasury Secretary, that they've attempted to really not only isolate Iran from the global financial system, but really cripple it economically, in terms of what the U.S. Secretary of State said there is to punish it and take punitive action for what the United States sees as its destructive foreign policy.
And Kimberly, interestingly, the Secretary of State in particular was questioned several times by journalists on what he had been saying the past couple of days about an imminent threat from Iran, including on U.S. embassies, that prompted the U.S. to kill General Qasem Soleimani. But he's still not providing any evidence on what that imminent threat is.
No, you're absolutely right. That was another one of the headlines to come out of that. And that is something that is certainly the subject of headlines here in the United States. Whether or not the president may have tried to detract from the negative impeachment headlines in the Senate trial, the impending Senate trial, by taking out General Soleimani in the form of an assassination. The White House is denying that this was an assassination for political purposes domestically, but certainly that is something that continues to hover over this White House in light of those briefings on Capitol Hill. One more headline to come out of there, Doreen, very quickly as well, is this discussion and this, once again, confusing message on U.S. troop withdrawal. We did hear earlier from the Iraqi Prime Minister in a statement that, in fact, there was a discussion with the Secretary of State and the Iraqi Prime Minister about putting in place a delegation in Iraq, a U.S. delegation, to begin putting in place a mechanism for the troop withdrawal. But we've since heard from the Secretary of State there and had a statement saying that isn't the case, that there's a real difference of opinion on that, and that any delegation sent to Iraq will be to discuss strategic partnerships, not troop withdrawal, that the U.S. work to eradicate ISIL from the region is not yet complete. So once again, confusing messages coming out of this administration, not concretes, not only on the imminence of the threat with regard to U.S. interests and the need to take out General Soleimani, but also the concern there about the troop withdrawal. Iraq saying that they need that to begin. The United States saying not so fast.
All right, Kimberly, thank you for that update from Washington. Let's find out if there's been any reaction from Tehran on these new sanctions. Dorsa Jabari joining us from there. As we're saying, Dorsa, 17 new sanctions targeting steel and iron industries in the country, as well as sanctions on 8 senior officials. Any reaction at all?
No, the Iranians don't usually respond to these kinds of sanctions. This is becoming a regular occurrence here. On a weekly basis, there are new U.S. sanctions announced on various individuals. We've had a plethora of sanctions really over the past 6 months on the country's supreme leader, the country's foreign minister, and now some of the high-ranking officials alongside those names, including the head of the Quds force, the head of the Basij forces, rather, that's the volunteer branch of the Revolutionary Guards, as well as the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani. This is a body that deals with the country's foreign policy as well as the nuclear issues under the guidance of the Supreme Leader. We also heard the name of Mohsen Rezai, who is a former head of the Revolutionary Guards. He is now part of the Expediency Council. So these are very high-ranking officials who will not be affected by these sanctions. They've never set foot on the United States, and they don't have any interests in that country. These are more seen as a symbolic, a political move, really, on the part of the U.S. government. What will likely happen is that his explanation, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo's explanation or reasoning behind the imminent so-called threat from General Qasem Soleimani is yet to be really flushed out. There is really no actual explanation that they have given. The one point to make here is that they believe by taking out this general, they've taken out somebody who had very much influence in this region. He's very much more of an ideology now in Iran. The Qasem Soleimani name is now associated with an idea more than anything else, and that's something that they cannot really get rid of. The other point to make is that the Secretary of the Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said that the previous U.S. administration gave $100 billion to the Iranians when they signed the JCPOA. It's important to point out that the Iranians got back $150 billion US that was under sanctions, that was frozen assets in the United States. That was their money prior to even the 1979 revolution. So those funds were released when they signed the JCPOA. That is something the Obama administration didn't simply give to the Iranians. These are important points to highlight. I think what we'll see in the coming days is a more sort of the same kind of rhetoric from here, that the United States continues this policy of economic terrorism on Iran after taking out one of the highest ranking generals within the establishment.
All right, Dorsa Jabari, thank you for that update from Tehran.